Welcome, y'all. It's my third day of making videos, but since I just started this new YouTube channel, Levine's Distance Learning channel, this may be your first day with me. If so, thanks for joining us. We're in the midst of talking about COVID-19, which I'll do for at least one more day, but I'm interested in people's feedback. What do you want me to talk about? But again, today we're talking a bit about Pueyo's article, Coronavirus, Why You Must Act Now. Let's get into it.
So today we're looking at epistemology in relation to Pueyo's article, Coronavirus, Why You Must Act Now. Unlike yesterday, when we were talking about mathematics, a subject that people are usually at least somewhat familiar with, I think I should say a little bit at the outset about what epistemology is. So for starters, epistemology is a branch of philosophy. And I think of philosophy as the rigorous and systematic investigation into those questions that people across disciplines and across different walks of life normally take for granted. Epistemology, then, asks questions like these, questions that we normally take for granted, that we normally leave aside, with respect to the concept of knowledge in particular. Knowledge is the key concept for epistemology. So we ask questions like, what's the relationship between knowledge and belief? What's the relationship between knowledge and evidence? And arguably one of the most famous issues in epistemology has been, can we really know anything at all? Do we ever get beyond mere belief or mere opinion? Do we ever get to a place where doubt is no longer justified? These questions represent the problem of skepticism. And as much as I think there's some value in thinking about these questions for a little bit to see that we do know things and how we know them when we do, thankfully the field of epistemology has been moving in considerably different directions lately. And previewing something I'll say near the end of today's video about Charles Mills, who is arguably the most brilliant human being alive today in my opinion, he says, for instance, about skepticism that, quote, if your daily existence is largely defined by oppression, by forced intercourse with the world, it's not going to occur to you that doubt about your oppressor's existence could in any way be a serious or pressing philosophical problem. This idea will simply seem frivolous, a perk of social privilege, end quote. And this is thankfully the direction that more and more of epistemology is headed in these days, toward much more practical issues, toward less frivolous things, and toward considering the ways in which social privilege, social marginalization, and social oppression can influence our practices and our beliefs in relation to the concept of knowledge. Moving in this practical direction is so important because there are a lot of really important practical issues that have to do with knowledge, that have to do with the things we study in epistemology. Furthermore, the coronavirus pandemic is clearly providing us with some of those cases, and Pueyo's article deals with a number of these issues where something about how we know things is really important to what's going on. So we'll start by building off of one of the things I talked about yesterday, namely the fact that the number of COVID-19 cases is growing exponentially. The question we want to look at here is, how do we know that? How do we know that when COVID-19 comes into a new community that it's going to grow exponentially? This is a particularly difficult question given what I said yesterday about the fact that what it means to grow exponentially is that the thing starts to grow gradually and then takes a sudden uptick. Previewing things a bit, what we'll say here is that we inductively infer this conclusion from both governmental and non-governmental organization-gathered empirical data. So we'll explain what that means, but then another issue that's really relevant to epistemology, and that Pueyo brings up in the article, is the distinction between true cases and official cases. This is what's really important for understanding the fact that the number of known COVID-19 cases is usually quite far behind the number of actual COVID-19 cases, and there are some really practical implications that follow from that. Finally, again, just like yesterday, there are lots of things that we won't discuss in relation to epistemology that we really easily could. So if you're interested at all in learning more about epistemology, Please let me know, because again, these are things that I can talk about in better detail than some of the things I will talk about in these videos. So some of the other epistemological topics we could talk about include racialized ignorance, the types of ignorance that arise from our living in an extremely racist society, action under uncertainty, how are we supposed to act when we don't know things for sure, peer disagreement, what do we do when our fellow citizens have very different beliefs about coronavirus and how to respond to it, how should that impact our own beliefs, and gaslighting. What do we do when there's misinformation that causes us to question our own ability to form beliefs? If you're moving through Pueyo's article and you've got this notion of exponential growth down that we talked about yesterday, you might think that you basically got what you need to understand this article, because you see a lot of similar looking graphs through the middle of the article which show exponential growth over and over and over again. So here with chart number 3, we see exponential growth of COVID-19 cases in South Korea, exponential growth of COVID-19 cases in Italy, exponential growth of COVID-19 cases in Iran. And we see this pattern continued in chart 4, with exponential growth of COVID-19 cases in France, in Germany, in Spain, in Japan, in the United States, in Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. After seeing a number of these graphs which show exponential growth of COVID-19 cases, you might be lulled into thinking that chart 6 here is just more of the same. But notice the first word in this chart's title, forecast. What we do when we forecast something is we're predicting what's going to happen in the future, and that's not what was going on in these previous graphs. The previous graphs reported on what had happened in the past up to the present, and this graph predicts what will happen in the future based on that. So even though these different charts here have very similar structures, they end up playing very different roles. It's recognizing the different roles that these different charts have that helps us see the structure of how we come to know things, like COVID-19 is going to continue to grow exponentially in different places throughout the world. As I said at the outset, coming to know that involves inductive reasoning from empirical data which is represented by the earlier charts. So we start off with the premise that COVID-19 cases grew exponentially in China, another premise that COVID-19 cases grew exponentially in Italy, and premises that COVID-19 cases grew exponentially in the United States, in South Korea, in Iran, in France, and so on. Furthermore, each one of those premises is built off of empirical data. Data gathered using our 5 senses, patients observing their own symptoms, and then doctors looking at those symptoms and combining these with tests that show whether the virus is present or not. This last bit brings up a whole other host of interesting epistemological questions, but those would take us too far afield. Now we just want to recognize that we're spotting a pattern here of every place that we've seen COVID-19 up till now has involved exponential growth, and we know that from using our 5 senses along with technology, looking at individual cases that are then reported to and presented to the public by governmental and non-governmental organizations. We're using all of that to come to the conclusion that it's reasonable for us to predict that COVID-19 will continue to grow exponentially in communities it is introduced to throughout the world. So the question is, what justifies that? What justifies us reasoning with patterns over time? And answering that involves looking into the study of logic, where what we do with logic is we study the different things we can do with arguments. We study making arguments, we study understanding arguments, we study evaluating arguments. And we don't have time to really get into that, but I do want to show you here some of the things you could look into if you were ultimately interested in learning more about logic. So logic has several large main branches involving different kinds of arguments, namely deduction, induction, and abduction, that get used in different ways in different disciplines. And then each of these has different types of arguments underneath them. and I could spend as long as anybody could ever possibly handle it talking about logic. I absolutely love logic. But what I really want to introduce you to here is the basics of the type of logic that went into noticing this pattern in the growth of COVID-19 cases and predicting that that growth will go forward. So again, when we study logic generally, we're looking at the study of arguments, where we understand arguments not in terms of arguing with people, but arguing for certain things we believe. So argument in the sense we're concerned with in logic is a two-part system made up of first, premise statements, and second, a conclusion statement, where those first ones, the premise statements, are meant to give us reason to believe the second. So induction, being a particular type of logic, is going to look at arguments, is going to look at premise and conclusion structures, but it's going to focus on those types of arguments where the goal is simply for the truth of the premises to make the truth of the conclusion more likely or more probable. And these types of arguments are based off of the fundamental assumption that the principle of uniformity holds, where the principle of uniformity is the idea that the future is going to more or less resemble the past, or at least that the laws governing the past and the future are similar. Of course, there are lots of issues that can arise with the principle of uniformity and with inductive arguments through issues like hasty generalization, confirmation bias, and others, but I think this is a successful case of inductive reasoning, so I won't get into these here. Instead, I just want to make it clear that this is an admittedly simplified version of what we ultimately use to justify the type of reasoning we went through in saying that because we spotted this pattern in the growth of COVID-19 cases in the earliest areas it hit, we're justified in predicting that this pattern will continue into the places that the coronavirus moves. This discussion of induction and its role in science gives me another chance to give a plug for another awesome Islamic Golden Age scholar, this time Ibn al-Haytham. Ibn al-Haytham was born in the 10th century CE in modern-day Iraq, but he's most famous for his work in Egypt, in particular under the Shia Caliphate of the Fatimids, shortly after their founding of the city of Cairo. In Cairo, Ibn al-Haytham did work that founded modern optics. He did work that I think makes him the first person to articulate something like what we think of as the modern scientific method. He also did groundbreaking work in mathematics and philosophy and theology. And for you cultural history nerds out there, he worked during the time of the famous Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. So again, just like yesterday, it sounds like I'm going to have to eventually do a video on the Islamic Golden Age, where one of the things I'll have to talk about is the phenomenal work of Ibn al-Haytham. Now, returning to the case of coronavirus and what we know about it, it's not only important for us to understand how we know what we know about it, it's also important for us to understand what we don't know about it. To give you an example here, look at this post from CNN last night. It discusses studies showing that people who didn't know they were infected are what drove the rapid dissemination of the coronavirus. So again, it's not just what we know, it's what we don't know that we need to understand here. The importance of knowing what we don't know, of knowing what we're ignorant about, is a theme that plays a large role in Pueyo's article as well. Take a look at chart 7 here, for example. What you'll see is again some exponential growth in the gray bars, but you'll also see exponential growth just behind that in the yellow bars. So the gray bars represent true cases of COVID-19. That is, they represent the growth in how many people actually have the coronavirus, whether or not we know they do. Whereas the yellow bars represent official cases. Official cases are where we know that somebody has the virus for sure because we've done a test on them and we've gotten the results back. So again, what we need to see here is that the growth of the official cases is significantly behind the growth of the true cases. This happens because once somebody is exposed to and infected with the virus, it takes time before they develop symptoms. Once they develop symptoms, it takes time before they see a medical professional. Once they see a medical professional, it takes time before they get tested for the virus. And once they get tested for the virus, it takes time before we get the results from that test. So again, we know that there's a significant lag between the true cases and the official cases. That is to say, from looking at what's happened in earlier outbreaks that were a part of this pandemic, we have good reason to believe the actual number of true cases we have today is significantly higher than the number of cases we know about. That's because we know that people who don't know they have the virus are the ones most likely to spread it, and we know that it takes time before a true case becomes known about, that is, before it becomes an official case. And this is one of the key reasons we need to socially distance no matter who we are and how we're feeling. Because given the nature of exponential growth, we may be at the gradual part of the exponential growth curve with respect to official cases, and at the sudden spike part of the exponential growth curve with respect to true cases, and this is where real danger can arise. Just like yesterday, I'm hoping that this introduction to epistemology has gotten you more interested in learning more about epistemology. And just the few things we brought up here have pointed to a number of different things in epistemology that we could have talked about a lot more. Namely, this distinction between what is the case, what we know about it, what we don't know about it, and what we know about those things leads to a classic discussion in epistemology over the question of whether or not our knowing something means that we also know that we know that thing. The idea that we do is called the KK principle, and interestingly, most folks think that the KK principle is false. But asking questions about what we know about things we don't know also leads to an entire subdiscipline of epistemology that has been growing for the last several decades, and I think is arguably the most important part of epistemology these days, namely the epistemology of ignorance. So the folks who pioneered the epistemology of ignorance recognize that we need to not just look at success in the epistemic domain. That is, we need to not just look at those cases where we achieve knowledge, but we also need to understand failure in the epistemic domain. That is, we need to understand what happens when we end up with ignorance, because unfortunately, ignorance is often thought of as a passive thing. When we're ignorant, it's just we lack the knowledge, we haven't yet gotten to the knowledge. But oftentimes, this isn't true. Oftentimes, ignorance is not passive in these ways. Instead, ignorance is constructed, and ignorance is constructed by social systems in problematic ways. Just like I mentioned at the outset of this video, I think Charles Mills is arguably the very best thinker on the epistemology of ignorance, and I'll leave you here with a quote of Mills that I used very heavily in the book I just finished, where Mills talks about the fact that racialized causality can give rise to what I'm calling white ignorance, straightforwardly for a racist cognizer, but also indirectly for a non-racist cognizer who may form mistaken beliefs, for example, that after the abolition of slavery in the United States, blacks generally had opportunities equal to whites, but because of the social suppression of the pertinent knowledge, though without prejudice himself. That is to say, social suppression can lead to ignorance, and this social suppression can be done for the sake of perpetuating oppression. So those of you who are interested in unpacking this idea, please go read some Charles Mills. Or, since you're on YouTube, type his name into the search bar. He's got a few phenomenal talks on here. Yet again, I want to make it clear that a phenomenal motivation for doing more intellectual work, I think, is music. And I won't make you listen to me rap this time, but I am going to give you a little bit of rap that I think connects really nicely to the things we talked about here today. In particular, this is a song by the Perceptionists called Out of Control. And one of the Perceptionists is Mr. Liff, maybe my favorite MC in the world. So check him out, he's the one with the glasses in the video I'm about to show you.
Yeah,
feeling?
yeah.
How
How you feeling? Feeling so out of control, man. The world's spinning out of control, yo. The world's spinning out of control. Maybe we're out of control. The world's spinning out of control, man. The world's spinning out of control, yo. The world's spinning out of control. World's spinning out of control, yo. The world's spinning. We're fighting over quote-unquote facts we'll never truly know whether it's true or false. It happened so long ago. Couldn't we define our own guidelines and decide that anything leading to crime is out of line if truly destructive and counterproductive? Even if you quote-unquote win, your karma sucks, kid. How you gonna progress through life off the back of another man's strife, off the death of another man's wife, off the death of a mother's kids? World of confusion, we flipped our wigs inside out, getting right before my kin dies out, breathing the sun before my skin dries out. I